Hey YouTube, I'm going to try to explain this and I'm hoping that a lot of people see the video because it's a good explanation and it'll tell you some of the reasoning behind some certain things about board sizes. First of all, let's just measure 2x4s that came from the from Lowe's. Now if I measure that, you see the 1/2 inch. I know it's upside down, but that's 1.5 inches. And if I measure this way, it's about 3. Let's see here. If I measure this way, it's about 3 3/8 rather than 3.5. Okay. Now, when you buy 2x4s, they're supposed to be 1.5 inches by 3.5. Now, it all depends on what the moisture content is, what they were planed down to. Wood moves around, okay, within itself. It gets bigger, it gets smaller, it gets longer, it gets shorter. That's the nature of wood. You need to understand that. That is the nature of wood. It's what wood does. It's why people invented that freaking plastic wood, because it doesn't move like regular wood does, okay? It doesn't absorb moisture like regular wood does. It doesn't dry out like regular wood does. Regular wood, like you're looking at there, the end of that 2x4, does things that plastic does not do. So once you understand that wood has a nature of its own, and you understand the nature, which is it absorbs moisture, it loses moisture, okay, which means that it shrinks and it swells. Alright, so when I cut this 2x4 last year, this 2x4 was 2 inches by 4 inches. And if you look there, you can see that it's 3 3/4 by 1 and a hair over 3/4. I'm just going to call it 3/4, okay? So it's 3 3/4 by 1 3/4. Now, if I wanted planed wood, like this 2x4s I got from Lowe's when I built this building, okay, these 2x4s, what I would do is plane this down to 3.5 by 1.5, okay? Now here's something else you need to realize. When you buy lumber, I gotta turn this meter back on, it timed out. When you buy lumber at Lowe's, normally framing lumber is at 19%. Now this thing has been sitting in my greenhouse for quite a while. You see the moisture content there? It's 10.4%. Now this is actually has less moisture in it than what framing lumber has in it, okay, because of sitting in the greenhouse. That's the whole point. So how much moisture is in wood can have a lot to do with the size of it, but moisture differences like between 19% and 10% are not going to make a whole lot of difference with the width or thickness of a board. Not a lot, okay? Now we're talking framing lumber here. I'm not talking about anything else. I'm not talking about any other kind of wood. I'm talking about spruce, pine, or fir, or hemlock, hem fir, things like that, framing lumber. So you can see how this changed. It went from 4 inches, it was a full 4 inches, okay, down to roughly 3 3/4 inches by 1.5 inches, or 1 3/4 inches, okay? So 3 3/4, now I know that's a little wide there, I'm going to go right here. But even depending upon where it is, it may slightly be different. You can see it's still 4 inches there, okay? So sometimes different parts of the wood shrink and swell. It all depends on what is there. Where there's no knots at all, it may shrink differently. Sometimes the grain that is in wood doesn't allow it to absorb moisture, or it might absorb too much moisture. It's all a matter of, you know, the moisture in the wood and the wood fibers itself. So the number one thing though here is that you understand that when the 2x4 was cut, it was cut to 2 inches by 4 inches, okay? And sometimes they shrink to a certain size. Now they don't shrink no half of an inch in both directions. I mean, when you buy the 2x4s like that at the store, it's 3.5 by 1.5. You certainly don't lose a half of an inch on a 2x4, okay, when you dry it. It just doesn't happen. It's not that much big of a difference. But you could lose a quarter of an inch. Could. All right? And sometimes you don't hardly lose anything. You lose even less than that. It all depends on how much moisture was in the wood before you're trying to please with wanting to have exact size wood. You know, if you're going to sell it and claim that it's 2x4s for framing, then you're going to have it down to 1.5 by 3.5, which is what you can plane this stuff to be, you know, once you get it into planer. But even then, you can adjust the planer. My point is, I go for 2 inches by 4 inches, a full 2 inch by 4 inch. Now you can see that this board, in some places it's lost a little more than others, but basically, if it goes down to like let's say 2 or 1 7/8 rather by 3 7/8, this is not the end of the world. You're talking 1/8 of an inch. 1/8 of an inch, I can split the difference, and now I'm down to a 1/16. A 1/16 of an inch in framing is not a big deal. Okay, now if you're a perfectionist, go be your perfectionist, but I know better because I've done it, lots of it. So what I'm trying to get at here is that the questions I get, you know, what size would I got a question the other day, what size would I cut wood if I was going to plane it? That all depends on what you're trying to accomplish in the end. You know, for these 2x4s, I'm not even bothering to plane these unless I'm going to use the face for something. Like let's say I was going to use a 2x4 for a deck. I might plane one face just to give me a nice smooth board on the deck surface, or 3 sides, or the whole thing. It all depends on what I want to do. You know, it's just not a question that I can answer directly. So the best thing to do is figure out how you want to end up. You can see from what I have here that sometimes the board shrinks as much as 1/4 of an inch on a 2x4, and sometimes they don't. It all depends on how you've treated it. When you surface dry wood, the moisture comes out of it so slowly that a lot of the wood doesn't really shrink that much, even though moisture comes out of it, because it's coming out of it very, very slowly. Just because there's a certain amount of moisture content in wood, you cannot... You can use that to assume that you're going to have shrinkage, but to say, for me to say, oh, this is a white oak, or I mean a white pine, and it has 40% moisture content, that means that when it's down to 10%, it's going to shrink given amount. There's no rules to that. There's an about, you can guess at it, but it's not going to give you perfection because wood's not perfect to begin with. Any kind of little imperfections in it, and just you can have 2 white pine trees. You know trees are different shapes. You know that from looking, from observation. But even the wood makeup of it, however it was fed, you know, whether it got more water or less water, whether it got certain minerals or didn't get certain minerals, all that has to do with how the tree grows. And I cannot begin to tell you, you know, what has taken place in a tree's life, or answer questions about, you know, how much will something shrink. The best rule of thumb is to cut it at least 1/8 of an inch bigger than what you want it to be when it's finished, and then hope that it doesn't shrink that, you know, too much so that you can plane it. Now that's the minimum. I don't even follow that. I go 1/4 of an inch in each direction to be able to come up with what I'm actually looking for. Now, if you've worked with framing lumber, you know that 2x12s are only 11 1/4 by 1.5. So you're losing 3/4 of an inch. So those 2x12s that I cut the other day, if I want to make them factory, I've got to reduce them down to 2 1/4 inches in the, or 11 1/4 inches in the width of them. Okay, The thickness will probably do it by itself if I plane them. Now I don't plan on planing them because I'm going to use almost all this lumber to frame out what's known as outbuildings, and you don't necessarily, depending on where you live, don't necessarily need to follow any particular type of lumber rules when it comes to, you know, the outbuilding. So let me take the moisture meter, and we're going to go over and look at the stuff that's in the kiln now. That's hardwood. Okay guys, so I don't know if you can see the thermometer in there and stuff, but it's 115 degrees roughly in there, and the moisture content looks like it's around 22%. Now what does that mean? Does that mean anything to the wood? It can, or maybe it cannot. Here's what I do know. That means that drying conditions in there, in the kiln, are excellent, okay? That's what that means, that the drying conditions are good. Now, what the wood has dried to after being out in the winter, and you know, the winter weather around here is not dry, it's a moist winter. Sometimes we get some, you know, low moisture days in winter, but not as many as we get that have moisture in the air. So I'm going to open up the kiln there. I'm going to take a look at what some of this wood has done now, being in there for all this time. Okay, so I'm going to shut the fans off so you can hear me talk. Bullseye. Bullseye. Okay. Stay around here, alright? Okay guys, so this wood on this side, the darker stuff is cherry, the lighter stuff may be red oak or maple, or let's see, I got red oak, white oak, and cherry on this side, okay? So I have the moisture meter on. I'm going to check, it's a piece of 1x4 cherry. First let me measure this, okay? Alright, so this is 3 7/8, and the thickness of this is 3/4 of an inch. Okay, so that's what that size is. Now, if I check the moisture content of this, it's at 7%, which is just about ideal for furniture. So this stuff on this side, if all of it's like that, I'll check another piece down here. Let me just show this to you. If you see that it's bouncing around from like 5, 7, 6, and that thing does that. But that's more than dry enough to get it out of here. So this lumber is perfect to go from here right into manufacturing furniture if you wanted to. Now when I store this stuff in my greenhouse, which is where I'm going to store it, the moisture content is going to vary in there because the greenhouse isn't sealed up like this and there's no fans blowing in there. Now when I first put wood in there that I know is wet, I usually put some fans in there with it. But this stuff right now is ideal. Let me check some of this maple. 6%. So this stuff is, you know, perfect for making furniture and doing whatever project you want it to do. But again, when I measured that there, you can see that it lost 1/4 of an inch in thickness, and it lost 1/4 of an inch in the, or it lost 1/8 of an inch in the width. Let me just check another one here. Okay, this, now see, I don't know if I made this 10 inches or not. Hardwood sometimes I won't cut hardwood sometimes perfectly. Okay, here's a 1x12, alright? Now this is a pine 1x12. So it's down to 1 3/4, or 11 3/4, I'm sorry. 11 3/4, and it's down to, let's see here. it's right at 1 inch for the thickness. So that can be planed, 1 by 12 would be planed down to 3/4 of an inch. And if I wanted to plane the width, which I very seldom do not plane the width, I usually surface or plane on both surfaces, but leave the edges go, because I can run, if I'm in need to make something personally myself and need a smooth face, I'll just run it through a hollow ground blade on a circular saw and cut it that way. Or I can, if I want to, my plane will open up a foot for a foot width, you know, height wise. But I normally don't do that. That's actually, to me, a waste of time. But anyway, let me check the moisture in this pine here. 6%. So that whole thing is already done, and it's been cooked to the point where it's just right for making stuff out of it. And the good thing about that is that what you see there, you know, once I take it out, plane it, or cut it, or do whatever I'm going to do, as long as I do it fairly quickly and I don't have any bad weather, that stuff is going to stay the way you see it. Okay, because once you take it and put it into the house, it's already lost all its moisture, so the ability for it to move is going to be greatly diminished between what I have in here and what you'll have when you put it into a house somewhere, you know, as hardwood. So, you know, this is just the nature of this, and sometimes you get things that work well and sometimes it doesn't work so well. It all depends on the wood, the quality of the log. I mean, I've showed you some of these logs that I have. Some of them are very nice and some of them have shake in them. And some of them have, you know, big knots or whatever that just affect the way the wood moves. Sometimes when you have a knot on the side of a board, that knot can make the board totally bend in the opposite direction. Why? Because think of it this way. A knot is basically already dry. What happens when you shrink the board against a solid knot that's on the one side of the board? It causes the ends of the board to go that direction, okay? Once you start to understand that, when you're making your cuts and you look at the lumber, you'll know whether you should be turning it or not to get the absolute best boards out of it. I mean, I can explain this stuff, but you actually have to do it. You have to see it. I cannot explain to you what every board says to me when I look at it. Some of them I don't even bother trying to read them. I just cut, you know, just to get the cutting done, especially if I got a nice log. But sometimes you got to turn things around. Sometimes you could be cutting a 1 by 12 or a 12-inch, let's say a 12-inch cant. Man, those boards are looking beautiful. They're coming off. They're looking nice. You put them in the kiln, you dry them, and they're bent, wavy, bent, bowed, skewed in every direction. Maybe and it could be because of the way the grain was. And you have to be able to understand all that stuff. So my recommendation is to, you know, watch channels where, like, I'm trying to explain my stuff to you. There's other channels that do the same thing, I think. I don't know for sure, but I'm trying to explain to you as I go what's happening so that, you know, the knowledge I have can get passed on. Now, a lot of times people listen to what I'm saying and then they'll watch part of a video, not hear the rest of the story, and then they're asking questions that don't really make a whole lot of sense. It reminds me of being in school. When I was teaching college, these freaking kids, you know, they'd be grab-assing in the back of the room playing games with themselves rather than, you know, listening to what's going on. So then 10 minutes after I'm done with my lecture, they'll ask me a question that I just answered in great depth because they weren't watching. But all I'm asking you to do is to, you know, watch the whole video. It doesn't mean somebody's stupid because they don't listen. It just means they're preoccupied, and they shouldn't be, you know, especially when you're in college paying for that education. Of course, kids today don't pay for nothing. They're getting it all free from AOC. But anyway, you heard what I said about this wood. Now, when I take this out of here and I start planing this, you'll get a good chance to see just how nice the wood really is. To me, what I'm seeing there, like even with this cherry, this 1x4, It's a nice clear looking board, basically. One little knot there, a little crack at one end. But don't forget my boards are longer. They're longer than the 8 foot. But the thing is when I plane it down, if I have to cut it to make a nice board out of it, I will. Because it's just what happens. That's why when you go to buy hardwood, it's so expensive when you're buying nice stuff. When you go down to Lowe's and you buy red oak like what I have in here, red oak is $8 a board foot. That means for 1 foot, like if this was red oak, for 1 foot of this, you're talking $8, $64 for an 8 footer. Why? Because it's usually all heart, which means it's from the center of the tree. It's dried to usually 7-8%, somewhere in there, sometimes less. You know, depends on Lowe's conditions in the store. They're not perfect either because their framing lumber is 19%. So I would imagine that sometimes it takes on moisture. It depends on what's going on. You know, the heat in the building has a lot to do with that, whether they leave the door open or not in the, you know, where you check out. A lot of that has to do with what the wood's going to be like once you get it home. And that's why they tell you when you buy paneling, take the paneling from the store, you get it delivered, put it in the room that you're going to install it in, and leave it sitting there for a day or two. Okay? The reason for that is, more would be even better. The reason for that is so it can shrink to the moisture content that it's going to shrink to for that particular room. That's the best I can tell you. Alright guys, so if you have questions on that and you want to put them in the comments, that's up to you. Have a good one. The one thing I want to add to this video is that I have shut the vents on this thing, and all I'm doing now is I'm just circulating the air that's in there. I'm just keeping the wood basically at what it's at. It's probably not going to pull a whole lot of moisture out of there. I'm just keeping it at what it is. When you have the vents shut, you're not allowing that air that's in there to move out of there and be replaced by anything. Okay, so just so you know.